And now Fernando is traveling around the country and around the world, spreading his message of what can be improved about different criminal justice systems. And the criminal justice system in America and the improvements is a discussion that we're about to have with these three panelists that I'm going to introduce you to. First off, we have Gabe Grand, Politics Fellow at Policy Mike in New York. Yi Wu, who's a contributor at Policy Mike in Providence, Rhode Island. Matt Pilisher is the producer of a documentary called Broken on All Sides. He's in Pennington, New Jersey. So to start out with you, Matt, what do you think is the main thing that's wrong with the criminal justice system?
Well, it's a hard question to pinpoint, but I think one of the main things is that we have the highest incarceration rates in the history of the world. We have the most people locked up. We have 25% of the world's prisoners, but we only have 5% of the world's population. We also have more of our racial minorities locked up than any other country in the world. So I think that's a good starting point for the problems.
And what's your opinion, Yi?
Well, I think the problem can be summarized by two excess and one inadequacy. Two excess being there are too many people in prison for the wrong reasons, and those who are in prison are in there for too long. And the inadequacy is that when the inmates get out of prison, former inmates, they do not get sufficient support to become productive citizens again.
And Gabe, what do you think is the main problem with our system?
Well, Marcus, I think that a lot of the problems that we're seeing with our criminal justice system actually can be traced back to problematic government policies that originated in the 1970s and 1980s when both federal and state governments decided to adopt tough on drugs, tough on crime policies that have caused our prison population to skyrocket by over 500% in the last 30 years.
And now we're going to get into each of those issues and each of your opinions. But also, first I'd like you to respond to one quote of what Fernando Bermudez said during my interview. Take a look.
Well, I think that we need to hold corrupt prosecutors like James G. Rodriguez, the prosecutor responsible in my case, accountable. He knew the evidence from the beginning, and he sought not to investigate, as well as, according to all the witnesses and documented evidence we have, he coerced and threatened the witnesses into falsely testifying against me. We also need a level of accountability for police departments who don't enact proper protocol with mistaken eyewitness identification reforms, which are the leading cause of why people land in prison.
Okay, now Matt, you heard Fernando there. He said that corrupt prosecutors is one of the main issues why people are landing in prisons. You've done a lot of research. Is that one of the issues that you found?
I haven't specifically looked into cases of prosecutorial misconduct, but I think the prosecutor's role and their discretion about whether and how to charge someone and what kind of deals they want to offer people is a huge problem in the justice system, and it is nearly impossible to hold prosecutors accountable for things like racial disparities. So I think that there certainly are stories and proven instances of prosecutorial misconduct. I think the way the system is set up to operate, prosecutors are encouraged to basically act on their own discretion, which, like any of us, we're going to have certain stereotypes and biases about who we think is likely to be a criminal or who should get a second chance because it was just a mistake.
Yi, how much do you think that prosecutors and their biases has to do with having people land in jail for the wrong reasons? What do you think?
I'm not sure if I would exactly use the word corrupt prosecutors because that involves some kind of a personal financial gain. But I think there is a problem of overzealous prosecutors that they will always press for the maximum sentence and the worst charge possible for sometimes very disproportionately, such as I don't remember the name on my head, but there was the MIT student who took JSOR articles, and he was threatened with many years in prison, even though that was certainly disproportionate.
Yeah.
That was Aaron Swartz, by the way.
Aaron Swartz. Okay. Sorry for forgetting the name. And especially in drug cases, when someone's tangentially involved in what they call a conspiracy, and they will be given a charge of distribution, and with the largest amount that the prosecutors can come up with legally, and that caused many women who are basically boyfriends of people who sell drugs, and they're only in a car or just around around the house, and they were sentenced for more years than the men who are actually selling drugs, because the woman didn't have any information to trade for a plea deal, while the men who know more had. So, but at the same time, I don't think it's the problem of bad people. Rather, it's a problem of bad laws. If we get rid of the laws against those non-violent drug possession, then the prosecutors wouldn't have those tools because to pursue these overzealous prosecutions. And so, I mean, prosecutors are people too. So there are good ones, there are bad ones. But we can't change human nature, but we can change what the laws on the books are.
Gabe, do you want to respond?
Absolutely. I think that we do have a problem with overzealous prosecution. But I have to say that the main issue and the thing that enables prosecutors to do so is actually our mandatory minimum sentencing laws, which offer incredibly strict penalties for sometimes minor, second or third offenses, especially relating to drugs. So I think that if we encouraged mandatory minimum sentencing reform, and again, place control of sentencing back in the hands of the judges on a case-by-case basis, you would actually see decreased instances of prosecutors who are pushing very harsh jail sentences, sometimes upwards of 10 years, on the grounds that there's a mandatory minimum on the books that allows them to do so. And the other issue there is that a lot of people who are in the position of being tried under a mandatory minimum law are going to take plea deals because they're scared that if they actually go and try the case, then they'll be, and they lose it, then they'll end up in prison for 10, 20, 30 years or even life.
Can I add something to that?
Go ahead, Matt.
That's a really good point. I think the whole plea deal system is really important to understand. And if you think about the fact that, for example, felony convictions, something like 94% of felony convictions are obtained through plea deals, plea bargaining. So most people are not going to trial, they're not seeing a judge or a jury of their peers. And again, the prosecutor acts as prosecutor and judge in a sense, because they're the ones that are basically getting the defendant to agree to plead guilty to a certain term that then, because of mandatory minimums in most cases, they know how much time they're going to get. So, people end up rotting in jail because they can't pay bail often because they don't have money, and that becomes a bargaining chip with the prosecutors saying, hey, if you plead guilty to this, we'll give you this much time and you can go home on probation or this or that. So I think to be aware of the whole plea deal system, and again, the discretion that prosecutors have is very important. And I just wanted to mention that the Vera Institute has a whole program that they've started around prosecution and racial justice, where it's so hard to get prosecutors to hold prosecutors accountable for racial disparities. Vera Institute, because of their reputation for fair courts and justice, has gotten prosecutors and district attorneys' offices to partner with them to open up their books and basically audit them, see how they're using their discretion, and if there's any disparities, to try and put into place systems to correct that.
Getting back to plea deals, Matt, what do you think the main disadvantage is of someone who's accused of a crime not getting to see a judge?
Well, a lot of people are, let's say, in jail, waiting there, and a lot of times, so I knew a guy that was in this position, and he appears in my movie. He's sitting in jail. He couldn't pull together $1,000 to get out. His bail was too high, and he comes from a community where his friends and family couldn't put together that kind of money, so he was rotting in jail waiting for trial. Well, a prosecutor comes to him and says, hey, if you take this deal, I'll just give you instant probation so you can get out, you can go home, you can see your friends and family, but you'll have a conviction. Well, you don't understand that maybe when you have that conviction, it's hard to get a job, you can't get public housing in some cases, you can't get a license to be a barber, you can't get financial aid to go to school. So a lot of people you don't explain to them the collateral consequences of a criminal record. So prosecutors are able to obtain convictions where perhaps if the defendant felt more confident, they would go to trial and defend themselves.
Gabe, what do you think about that related to not seeing a judge because of plea deals?
Well, I think put very simply, the big problem with that is that when a defendant doesn't appear before a judge, justice isn't carried out. The case isn't heard. And I think it's very easy for someone like a prosecutor who spends their entire life working within the criminal justice system to intimidate someone who isn't part of that and who doesn't spend their life in the criminal justice system. So I think that's the biggest issue there.
Now, getting over to Yi, I want to get back to one issue that was brought up in the conversation so far, and that was race was brought up briefly. And I saw in your piece on policy, Mike, you mentioned how the disparities between African Americans and whites who are in jail. You said that 1 out of every 12 working age black men are imprisoned versus whites, which is 1 out of 87. So that's a huge difference. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes. So there are certainly racial disparity, both in how the laws are enforced, in terms of police tend to profile minorities. That's a problem that's quite common. And there's also the infamous crack versus powder disparity when it comes to war on drugs, where crack cocaine was sentenced to how do you phrase it, to much longer sentences than powder cocaine, and because of the racial demographics of drug use, that incarcerates black drug offenders much longer than their white counterparts, and as a consequence, I think even though drug use is pretty even among different races, however, there's much more blacks and Hispanics being imprisoned for the same thing than for the white population. So I think this disparity definitely exists from the beginning when police arrest someone to the end when someone is sentenced.
And one of your pieces, Gabe, you also mentioned drugs. Also, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of covering the war on drugs, and I have to say, being here in New York, which is where I work, I did a piece recently where I was reporting in the South Bronx, and I spent a lot of time just walking around and talking to people. And I have to say that almost every single person that I talked to had recounted some experience of either personally being stopped and frisked by the New York City police, or watching a friend or a group of friends stopped and frisked. And I think that when you're looking at why is there such a great racial disparity in our criminal justice system, in the sense that more Hispanics and more blacks are being locked up, that's your answer right there. You know, if we had police walking around, for example, the Upper West Side, just stopping and frisking people on their way home from work in suits, people would be up in arms. But, you know, we have marginalized communities where the police presence there essentially amounts to a war, giving a new meaning to the war on drugs. In other words, these communities are actually occupied by the police. And so when that kind of thing happens on a day-to-day basis, it's very easy to get used to it, but that doesn't make it just. In fact, it's incredibly unjust.
That's great. That's well put. The other thing is, not only would those, communities be up in arms on the Upper West Side, but they would actually find a lot of drugs. because we know that, across populations, across races, people use drugs and sell drugs at roughly the same rates. So if African Americans are 12%, 13% of the U.S. population, they're the same percentage. They're 12 or 13% of the drug using and drug dealing population. But in some states, 90% of drug offenders sent to prison are black. So it just is totally skewed from reality of drug use and drug dealing. And I think it, again, has to do with who we perceive of as drug users and drug dealers, what our stereotypes are about who to go after for drug crimes.
Now, staying on the topic of drugs, getting back to Gabe for a moment, you, in one of your articles, mentioned that drug rehabilitation and education as two of the better solutions as opposed to imprisonment. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think drug rehabilitation and education and a whole lot of other progressive programs that are out there are, in fact, good alternatives to prison, because what we have here is a system that relies far too much on the criminal justice system and doesn't rely nearly enough on rehabilitation. It's called the Department of Corrections for a reason, yet what we are doing right now is we are taking people, sometimes from a very young age, and putting them in a context where they are essentially spending all of their time when they're in prison hanging out with other people who have been convicted. And they're hanging out with other criminals. And they're inside an environment where crime is actually promoted. So prisons do far more harm than good in terms of reducing crime. So I think that there's a lot of evidence out there that shows that these programs can, in fact, be a good thing. And I would also have to put in a word about intervention from an earlier age. In other words, rather than having what we would call juvenile delinquents, in other words, someone who at a young age has committed, usually minor drug offenses like selling marijuana, instead of putting those people inside a juvenile detention facility, why don't we have programs where we educate these people about the problems that can result from drug use and set them on a better course for the rest of their life?
Yee, what you just heard from Gabe right there, he just said that prisons can do more harm than good. What do you think about that?
I absolutely agree, and actually I will go further. Then when Gabe mentioned that we rely far too much on the criminal justice system regarding the issue of drugs, I believe that the criminal justice system should not be used to resolve the so-called drug problem at all. As one of the Baltimore mayor said, that the Surgeon General should be carrying out the war on drugs, not the Attorney General. So, and even the head of NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, has explicitly stated that addiction is a disease, that it should not be a crime. When you put the criminal stigma on someone, even if he's only in prison for a short time, or even if he's on probation, it's still there's a criminal stigma to it. So if I or someone else who has a drug addiction and wants to seek treatment, and the first thing you have to do is to admit that I'm a criminal. Well, certainly that's a disincentive for someone to seek treatment, and that just exacerbates the drug problem. So the ultimate solution will be legalize and regulate. However, before that's done, I think incremental reforms, such as Gabe mentioned, about abolition of mandatory minimums, as well as better treatment programs, that would help at this stage as well.
Matt, what do you think about Yee's comment about the way that we're handling drugs and the criminal justice system?
Yeah, I totally agree. We have a panel of agreement here.
Yeah, I see that.
I think that drugs should be treated as a public health problem. I also think that, things could be used and regulated. Tobacco is a drug, alcohol is a drug, We've found ways to deal with them. People are always going to use drugs. Sometimes they will abuse them. Sometimes there will be addiction. There should be a lot more public health treatment options for drugs and for alcohol and the underlying mental illness that usually is associated with addiction. That would do a lot more to prevent drug crime or drug violence, things like that, than keeping it illegal. Which actually creates more crime with the prohibition. So I'm all for the decriminalization or the legalization of all drugs and treating it as a public health concern.
Okay, Gabe, it seems like one thing that we're continually coming back to, at least within this panel, is drugs. Do you think that that is one issue that it seems like there's an overwhelming amount of support that this needs to be changed?
I think you are seeing an overwhelming amount of support, but it's being, in some cases, defeated by very powerful lobbying organizations and lobby groups. And those groups are really just arms of a few specific industries that would not like to see change in this area. And I can tell you exactly what that is. It's the privatization of prisons. More and more we're seeing states and the federal government rely on private companies to send off their prisoners to private correctional institutions. And the problem with that is that there's a conflict of interest inherent in doing business by locking people up. A lot of these private prison corporations, and I can name a few, the largest one is the CCA, followed by the GEO group. Those two in particular, the Corrections Corporation of America and the GEO Group, have been responsible for lobbying tremendous amounts to preserve laws that tend to lock a lot of people up. And the simple reason behind that is the more people that they have behind bars, the more money that they make. And so, no, they would not like to see change. So that's the opponent you're seeing here. But I think that a lot of Americans who are educated about this will say that, yes, they support reform.
What do you think about that, Matt?
I think it's true. I think sometimes the privatization can be overemphasized in prison reform circles. I think it's a particularly insidious problem. People should not be, directly profiting and like stocks and bonds sold on the stock exchange as these companies are for over people being locked in cages. But it's only about, I think, 6 or 7% of prisoners in the U.S. that are in private prisons. It goes beyond private prisons and these groups lobbying. I mean, whole towns in rural America are built around prisons and prison economies. So there also needs to be thought about what could replace those jobs. You hear rural Pennsylvania people advocating to their representatives to have a prison built there so they have more jobs. Well, I think that points to then sort of wider changes that have to happen in this economy along with criminal justice reform. You would have to start thinking about, well, how do we have better employment in our rural areas, maybe more of a green economy or some kind of thing that would create jobs rather than the prison towns that pop up. So I think that also means changing people's perceptions about, is it good to have a prison built in my town? Is it good to make laws based on our moral judgments? And I think that's what the drug war is. A lot of people in America think that drug use is bad, it leads to addiction is bad, so it should be illegal. Well, I think if you start to explain to people what can actually stop people from using drugs, stop intravenous needle exchange that leads to higher HIV rates and diseases, better treatment options can actually better help addiction, then people would start to change their minds. But I think you need also an economic alternative in place rather than the prison system.
Talking a little bit about what the solutions are to the problem. Matt, you looked and found tons of problems with your documentary, Broken on All Sides, but through your research, and can you bring up some of the information that you had through your documentary and steps that can be taken, at least initial steps that can be taken that can solve some of the issues that you have with the system?
Yeah, I'll say a few things. I think Gabe and Yi have both been incredibly well spoken on, changing drug policy and mandatory minimums, and I totally agree. I think that we, lock people up for way too long for every offense. Yi mentioned this early on, but people that commit very violent crimes are also kept in prison way longer than they actually need to be in order to prevent crime and ensure public safety. So I think we could also look at, for example, I did the documentary in Philadelphia. In Pennsylvania, life sentence means life. You're going to die in prison. There's no option for parole. Well, that means we have an aging prison population. We have people that are 80, 70, 80 years old in there that studies show they are not going to come out and recidivate and commit more crime. We should make those people eligible for parole and, back into society rather than locking them up for so long. But I think in order to get these kinds of changes, we need to really organize a movement to put pressure on the powers that be, on those corporations that benefit from the current system, and also on politicians who don't want to be the next one to let out on parole the random guy that then goes and commits a murder. We need to push them to be smart on crime. We need to organize a new civil rights movement to really put pressure and make these changes.
Yi, do you think that a civil rights movement, something that big, is really what's necessary to make these changes?
Well, I see that there is already a movement that is beginning, and that movement is even bipartisan. That in Chinese there is an adage saying that whoever ties a bell on a tiger's neck has to untangle that bell. So both parties have created this mess during the Reagan years with the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which created a lot of and much longer mandatory minimums, and with enthusiastic support from the Democratic Party. So, and in 2000s, I think there are groups on the conservative side that actually started to rethink how they approach criminal justice policy. One of the groups is called Right on Crime, which is started by the Texas Public Policy Foundation, if I remember the name right. And they admit that, although they still wouldn't admit the creation of those tough on crime policies was wrong to begin with, but they're now saying, well, it has been in excess. There has been too much in the direction, so they're scaling back. And I think now with the Justice Department, Attorney General Eric Holder coming out supporting some kind of moderate reform, and when the two forces fuse together, I think it is going to be a movement that's going to push forward, and that movement needs grassroots support. So I agree with Matt that there should be more people in the public to put pressure on legislators who still would not come around on this issue. And but for now, I'm cautiously optimistic about the movement that has been building from the ground as of this point.
Well, Gabe, we've done a fair amount of talking about the issue, and the panel has done a fair amount of bashing of the system, bringing up all the issues. We are trying. That is the topic of conversation. But do you feel that the current system, as it is, do you think that it's filling the purpose? Do you think it's keeping us safe? Because that is at the base of what the criminal justice system is for. Do you feel like it's accomplishing that?
Well, I think that a lot of Americans have a misconception that the more that you lock up, quote, the bad guys, the more public safety you're going to have, which is really just not true, because many Americans have a black and white view of crime. In other words, you're a criminal or you're not a criminal. And I think that needs to be changed, and I think people need to be open to a more nuanced understanding. And going back to sort of your question about this new civil rights movement that's emerging, I actually think that that's a very apt term, because I don't know if, Marcus, you're familiar with the book The New Jim Crow, but that book essentially details exactly what we're talking about here, which is, much as the civil rights movement the 60s sought to dismantle the policies of Jim Crow that were really oppressing African Americans. We're seeing now a lot of African Americans locked up in our system, and it's akin to Jim Crow. It's fulfilling the same exact role that those racist laws did. So yes, I think that there does need to be a new form of civil rights movement.
Matt, I think your documentary touched on that that directly. What Gabe just said, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you compare so many of the legal segregation that was going on in Jim Crow era, and you look at how felons are treated today, there's so many similarities about how it's okay to discriminate once you've been labeled a felon. You know, excluded from voting rights in many cases, excluded from serving on a jury. You know, we've talked about excluded from having a fair trial. Employment, housing, access to education, public benefits. You know, so many of the old forms of discrimination are similar. And then when you have such severe racial disparities about who is locked up, and it ends up being mostly African American, you have to start thinking of this as the new Jim Crow. And Michelle Alexander, the author of that, appears in my movie, and the movie sort of uses Philly as an example to tell that story. And so I think that that's absolutely right. You also have to look at shifts in the global economy. You know, there were a lot more jobs available in the inner city for low-skilled workers back in the 1960s. We had horrible segregation and discrimination, but you know, people in the inner cities had access to more jobs. Now, through the changing of the global economy and neoliberalism, and automation, a lot of those jobs have disappeared. And it was this kind of perfect storm of, you know, the civil rights movement happening, the Black Power movement. Cities across America were burning down, and African Americans were demanding their rights. There was a law enforcement response to that. And then at the same time, all of these jobs were just evaporating from the cities. So, you know, the law enforcement response becomes not only a reaction to the social movements, the protests and the riots going on, it also, prison becomes a place to house people that we no longer have formal jobs for in this economy.
All right. Can I just add a little bit to it?
Go ahead.
I definitely think that it is the over-incarceration and the racial disparity in criminal justice definitely is a reversal of a lot of the gains made in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And as I wrote back then, earlier this year, in an article, now there are black people work less hours than 1970s. And there is actually a higher percentage of blacks in the United States incarcerated than in the same percentage in apartheid South Africa. Since I was reminded of this statistic since Nelson Mandela recently passed away tragically, and I think that's something people should wake up to.
Interesting statistics, and we're going to have to wrap up our conversation there. Thank you very much to our three panelists who joined us today: Gabe Grand at Policy Mike, Yi Wu also at Policy Mike, and Matt Pilisher from Broken on All Sides. Thanks very much for joining us, and you can see the full discussion of our panel at harun.me.